All right, let's get started since we're recording and we have a few people hopping on online. I am also online on my computer, kind of looking at who we have here and making sure that we have a quorum from our representative bodies here. As everyone is chiming in, and maybe some people are going to come in person, just a little housekeeping. Thank you for shutting the door. It was a little windy in here today. There was a water line break in the coffee maker, and it's always something. It brought back a little bit of memories. We went on vacation a summer or two ago, and our hamster escaped while we were gone and chewed through the water line in our refrigerator. Completely flooded our house. So all their fans here are giving me some, past trauma memory going on here. So I just really appreciate staff being here. I just want to note that Doug and Melinda could not make it today, and we'll have staff here introduce themselves as well. Hopefully you all have the agenda open. We will do welcome and introductions today. I do want to kind of preface this meeting with, this one is a little bit more relaxed than we normally have, mainly for the fact that we generally won't be, voting on anything today. In the past, we have voted on, whether or not we would, move towards supporting certain legislation or not. So we'll have a little bit more of a relaxed setting today. As you go through your agenda, you'll notice we have the legislative session recap, the bylaws subcommittee designation, and the engagement in the legislative off season and what that might look like. And then maybe we can even get out here a little earlier than normal too. So I'm all about short meetings too, just, as long as it's meaningful. So let's welcome everyone who's been online and in person here. I'll go around the table and then let's do online first and then we'll go around the table. I'll just start at the top with the A's. Of course, Abe, go first.
Good morning, commissioners. Abe Layton from Douglas County.
Thank you. Bill? Bill, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I had to unmute myself. Bill Holen, Arapahoe County Commissioner, with my efficient, effective staff person here with us.
Thank you, Bill. And Cam?
Yes, Cam Kennedy, Dr. Cog staff, transportation assistant.
Cam is here in person. Cody?
Cody O'Brien, Arapahoe County staff.
Great, thank you. Danae?
Good morning, Danae Brilliard, Broomfield staff.
Thank you. Daniel?
Good morning here on behalf of Commissioner Watson. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Watson bringing in some extra staff here.
Bringing them in.
Emma? Commissioner Pinter?
Yep. Hi, hello. Emma Pinter, Chair of the Board, Adams County.
Great, thank you. Heidi Grove?
Heidi Grove, the other Heidi, Boulder County staff.
And I will dare to say the much highly esteemed Heidi Grove. You've done so much work in the work of homelessness. So thank you so much, Heidi. Jillian?
Jillian Coffey, Adams County staff.
Great, thank you. Catherine?
Good morning, everyone. Kathy Smith, Community Resources with Arapahoe County.
Thank you. Councilmember Lewis?
Hi, Councilwoman Lewis from Denver, District 8.
Thank you. And Ron?
Yeah, Ron Pepsdorf, Transportation Planning Director here at Dr. Cog, part of the B team supporting you this morning.
You're just the A team.
Good to see y'all.
The A+ team. That's great. Sharon? Commissioner Odoricio? I feel like saying Bueller.
Did you just do a thumbs up?
Okay, glad to have you here, Commissioner Odericio. Commissioner Kraft-Tharp,
Good morning, Tracy Kraft-Tharp, Jefferson County.
thank you. And then we'll start in person if you haven't introduced yourself.
Good morning, Darrell Watson, Commissioner for Seaton County of Denver.
Okay. Feel free.
And Rich Morrow, Director of Legislative Affairs for Dr. Cog.
Great, thank you all for being here. And Sharon, are you here? I know I gave you a little bit of time, but sometimes you need to unmute.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Sharon Tessia, Broomfield staff.
That's okay, great, glad to have you here. Lots of staff here, lots of representatives, and I think we're missing a few. I think, which county are we missing? Do we have a Boulder County Commissioner here today? Oh, Marta, there you are.
Buenos dias, everybody. I don't know if this is in the introduction part and if you can hear me.
It is, yes, welcome.
Thank you. We had a workforce Boulder County meeting downstairs, so I just came running up from our 8 o'clock start. So just thank you and appreciate the all the prep work and information that was sent ahead of time.
Sure, thank you. I was gonna mess with you and say, it's your turn to present, and that would have been funny and also not funny. Thank you. Did I miss anyone? Great, I think we're good. Thank you everyone for being here today. We wanted to introduce just sort of a way to move forward as Metro Area County Commissioners, adding even more structure. It seems like every year we add more structure to ourselves, but also not too much structure because there's only 7 of us. So that's a good thing, I think, you know, to be nimble, but also, you know, gain traction within our own city council for Denver and us in Broomfield, and also the county commissioners in the metro area. And so it has seemed fitting that we've moved under sort of the arm of Dr. Cog and really appreciated their supportive services. And we, you know, developed a logo. We have also elevated the topic of homelessness. And I think, you know, the next step is just really talking about what has affected us regionally. So Commissioner Watson and I met and just started talking about, you know, we need to really look at, in hindsight, what happened in our legislative session in 2024 that affected us in the metro area as counties. And then as we move forward, what do our bylaws look like? We will be asking and discussing about subcommittees for bylaws. And then also, what does engagement look like in the legislative off season? And I don't know how you all feel, but in Broomfield, we're feeling quite heavily that we need to be doing a lot of this work, not instead of the legislative season, but definitely a lot more work in the off season where we can kind of help do stakeholder work with our legislators. So again, thanks for being on the call today. And we have next up is our 2024 legislative session recap with Rich Morrow, the Director of Legislative Affairs for Dr. Cog. Take it away.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. I'll be pretty informal here, so if you've got questions or comments on anything, just jump in, and if there's any detailed questions on some of them I can't answer, I'm sure Ron can, depending. I'll start with, as I understand it, the MACC took positions on 2 bills this year, House Bill 1372, which regards the law enforcement use of prone restraints, and then House Bill 1322, which addresses HIPAA Medicaid waiver.
So we did 2 positions. One of them was not on the proposition, actually.
Oh, it wasn't?
Yeah, it
That gave me
was.
the wrong number.
No, that's okay. That one was on the background checks for massage.
Oh, for the massage parlors, yes,
Yes.
okay, all right.
So.
Well, I didn't research that one.
And that's fine.
That's okay. Abe is here.
But I figured there'd be other people here who, since you took positions on them, would be following. So I don't know, do you want to ask Abe to give an update just on that one, where that ended up?
Yeah, Abe, do you want to speak to that bill?
Yeah, to 1371.
1371.
That's the one. It's sitting on the governor's desk, so it made it through both houses. Thank you so much for the incredible unanimous support from MACC. We got unanimous support from CCI as well, and a lot of stakeholders. So, this is moving in the right direction. I think, globally, from a legislative standpoint with human trafficking, we always hear the statistic that there are more human trafficking sites than there are Starbucks in the metro area. So this really is a metro area county commissioners issue. My hope is that we can be a little bit more intentional about the legislation going into next year. And I know there is a nonprofit called From Silenced to Saved. And if you know Janelle Goodrich, who runs that nonprofit, she works basically for free. And she even adopted a young child, an African-American female, out of human trafficking, and is a wonderful parent to that young girl and her two biological children. So we really believe in the nonprofit, but she tried to run a bill around increasing criminal penalties for Johns, for the people that are pursuing these activities, particularly from underage individuals. And that was a tough uphill lift. It was the first bill she's ever run. So she needs some help, and we all have lobbyists. And I think that this may be something that as a group we could take a peek at. Heidi, I was going to text you, but for historical context, the reason that MACC kind of fell apart maybe 8 years ago was because of the legislative work. People from different counties ended up in different corners based on partisan issues, and it just fell apart and became more of a lunch and learn type thing. And so, Steve, myself, Eva, a few others, finally, after, 4 or 5 years, said, look, let's get MACC back engaged. And so I think the secret sauce there is when we can find bipartisan issues that we all can agree on, things that just make sense, regardless of your party affiliation. I think that might be our magic going forward. I think if we get too partisan, it could lead to the same historic breakup that we had in the past. So just wanted to provide that context. And I know, Heidi, you didn't ask for all that. So just yay on 1371, waiting the Gov signature.
I was going to say, Abe, are you just deliberately jumping ahead in the agenda? Or?
Yes, I am.
Well, if there's one thing I've known since Abe in 8th grade, he is not dumb. You're very smart, Abe, and I really appreciate that. Yeah, and I really appreciate the efforts in that arena. I know that sometimes when you go to the legislative arena and you are not in the majority, Abe, I know that it could be, sort of an uphill battle, but I feel like that bill was important to many of us. And, for those who even wanted an amend position, it was still important. So I really appreciate all your work on that. So thank you for that legislative update.
You're welcome.
Great, Rich, take it away.
All right. So I will start with this packet that we used for the DRCOG board last week as the legislative wrap up, and first topic were older adults. And I'll maybe make an editorial comment that one of the things I've always found over the many years down at the Capitol is when talking about aging issues is almost always bipartisan. We've very seldom run into partisanship on those. And that was pretty much the case this year as well. So from DRCOG's perspective and our area agency on aging, we spent enormous amounts of time, even before the session, going back to last summer, really, working on funding issues for the AAAs and not just DRCOG, but really the whole state. And tried to get the governor to put a $5 million increase in state funding for senior services into his budget, which he didn't do. So we started lobbying the Joint Budget Committee and had a lot of good discussions with them. At various times, we were confident that they were going to do something in the long bill. But by time March rolled around and they had to do figure setting to finalize the numbers in the long bill, they ended up not doing anything. So that was a disappointment. And at that point, we made a decision that when they introduced the long bill, we were going to mount an effort to amend the bill, which can happen. It's not easy. You got to lobby every member of both chambers. But as happened throughout that process, I was personally gratified how many people and groups and governments stepped up to really help us advocate. At that point, we were advocating for a $6.1 million amendment to the long bill, which that number tied to a report that the Department of Human Services had released, putting a number on the waiting list that were existing throughout the state. So with that, we were able to get that amendment on in the House. We were also able to get that amendment on in the Senate. And again, it was very, very bipartisan. We had bipartisan sponsorship of the amendments in both chambers and large majorities in both chambers to pass those amendments. When all was said and done, the JBC met as the conference committee, and they did have a lot of tough decisions to make. And as they did with many of the pretty much all of the handful of amendments that passed, they cut ours down to 2 million. So we ended up with $2 million in the long bill, which, you know, we have to say is still better than where we started. But it also means that we've got more work to do. And that brings me to Senate Bill 40, which originated with a $5 million appropriation, which sort of paralleled what we had asked for in the budget. Since once the long bill process finished, we pretty much had to just take that appropriations clause out. And there was also a provision providing for annual increases in funding based on inflation, which we got word from the governor's office that OSPB wasn't crazy about. So at that point, we agreed to take it out. I still want to revisit that issue. Senate Bill 40 then contains provisions that require the Department of Human Services and the Office of State Planning and Budgeting to work with representatives of the area agencies on aging over the next 3 months to complete a review of the adequacy of the funding for senior services by the end of by the end of August. And the reason for that timing is that by then, hopefully, we will have developed enough information and data to convince the governor that it needs to put something in his budget this time. And we'll have had the opportunities to really address the issue in a more formal way, and then complete or engage in similar evaluations every 3 years going forward. So we're constantly reviewing the funding for the AAAs. That bill I know has been, it passed both houses, obviously. It's been signed by the President of the Senate and Speaker of the House, so it's on its way to the governor. We haven't heard any problems, so hopefully the governor will be signing it, but you never know. So that, and there's another bill on there that was House Bill 1211 that it was sort of an opportunistic bill that I think it's right above 40. Yeah. That we actually worked on as the Joint Budget Committee was doing the supplementals for this fiscal year back in January. And we're able to convince them to introduce a bill providing or creating a contingency fund and initially seeding it with $2 million that would top up every year. So the idea is for there to be $2 million there for every year. And I think the bill sunsets in 5 years, so we'll have to revisit that. But that money would be available for emergency circumstances that AAAs or their providers could apply to the state initially for 3 months of funding in an emergency situation, and they can reapply for another 3 months going forward. So that bill is going to need to be fleshed out, and we're going to see, as with Senate Bill 40, how these get implemented. So we're going to have plenty of follow-up work to do in the coming months on those.
Rich, how prescribed were the emergencies?
Somewhat. I know we had acts of God in there. We had like sudden interruptions in services. And those are the two I can remember off the top of my head. So I know the department's talking about wanting to do rulemaking. It's not required, but I'm sure we'll get together and try to figure out some of the more detailed procedures. The next one on this list, I think, is the other bill that the MACC, I was told, took a position on, this House Bill 1322. And the way I would describe it is HCPF, Healthcare Policy and Financing, is already in the process of preparing what they call an 1115 waiver, which I understand is focused on, from the federal point of view, focused on innovative programs in Medicaid, particularly what's mentioned in this memo, health-related social needs, and how to get Medicaid more involved in covering health-related social needs. There was a bill last year, I think it was 1300, that kind of kicked off that process for HCPF. This year, Representative Brown came back with a bill that directs HCPF to include housing assistance and food and nutrition services into that waiver. Now, it does say that they wants them to do a feasibility study over the coming months of this year to make sure that they can do that in a way that's budget neutral to the state, and then add it to that waiver. And the assumption is that they will be able to do that. And as I understand, the way it would work is that the state would basically like bundle its funding for those types of services. And then if CMS, Medicaid and Medicare Services approves the waiver, then the feds would match that amount of money, and we'd be able to leverage fairly significant federal funds to include those services. That bill did pass, and it's already sitting on the governor's desk. So
Great. Does anyone want to discuss that since we've been supportive?
Commissioner Grove.
Heidi Grove?
Yeah, I put this in the chat. Just FYI, we did get supportive service funding written into that bill as well for
So you guys did
reimbursement.
that. I saw that was
we did.
Was put on. Yeah.
Hence why I need to give you a new title.
We did that.
Yes.
We need to give Heidi Grove a new title.
Yeah, I thought that was good when I saw that. So that's great.
Yeah, it's really kind of key work, because housing is such a key indicator of health. And I feel like, with supportive services, that would be really key in that area.
Yeah.
Heidi, do you have any thoughts about next steps on that or what that could look like?
Well, the nice thing is the bill, so there's a couple of things happening. The bill was doing its process through the Senate, and then the governor's office said whether it passes or not, we're going to sign it. So it kind of expedited the process. So HCPF is supposed to come back with their analysis by, I think, November, with the aim of submitting the waiver itself no later than April. The challenge that we're going to see is that there's one of two ways that we can do this. So we can either assess whether there's an already standing 1115 that we can amend, which will give us about a 3-year turnaround to see these, the change in the financials. If we have to write a brand new one, we're talking 5 years. So I've been telling our partners and our providers that now is the time. If you don't have access to bill Medicaid for services, now is the time to actually start putting in the prep work.
Gotcha. So what does that look like, Heidi?
Oh, that's a whole huge process. Like, you have to get your NPI, and you have to do, You have to get certified as a federally qualified healthcare facility. You have to have licensed clinicians. Like it's a whole to do. Like you don't have to have every staff member that is a licensed clinician. You just have to have one that is supervising the work. The other piece that happened a couple years ago was the state actually expanded a Medicaid billables for peer work. So certified peers can actually be billed for Medicaid. So that's another arm of this kind of big win for us, is that both peer work and also now case management work can be in the future reimbursable through Medicaid.
Gotcha. Okay.
Can I ask her a question?
Yeah, yeah.
Heidi, one of the things that came to my attention, and I don't know if it in the same way up in Boulder, was that because I had a conversation, I think it was with Representative Brown about this, that they were looking at Medicaid or HCBUF being able to potentially contract with what he referred to as non-traditional Medicaid providers, and said that area agencies on aging and the providers that they typically fund could also be involved in this process potentially. I don't know what the details might be in order to do that, as you started to talk about the various certifications and so forth. But needless to say, AAA's already fund nutrition, especially somewhat housing support services too. So that was another angle to this too that we were looking at, depending on how this waiver process plays out. And I don't know if you
Yeah, I mean, this waiver is pretty impactful for multiple populations. And so the non-traditional kind of approach is that equity lens that we really wanted to bring to the table. Like we know our smaller nonprofits, they don't have the money to get an electronic health record or pay for a Medicaid like accountant and all of these things. So that was part of that equity lens that we wanted to bring to this bill, because it would be such a disservice to all the work that went into this if just, Denver Health is the only one that can access these funds. And so those are the conversations that we're having now.
Got it. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Heidi. I appreciate that. Rich, any other questions about this? I'm not
I
seeing.
think those are the main ones in the older adults area.
Okay, transportation.
Now we get into transportation and housing. A lot, obviously, and I think the collective wisdom of this group is is probably pretty significant on most of these bills. And also, this is the area where I'll call on Ron probably a lot. Because I would say, from my perspective, as essentially Dr. Cox's lobbyist, it was really helpful to have Ron and Doug and Sheila Lynch here, as I always call them, our subject matter experts. I'd get questions down at the Capitol or people would email me, and I find myself constantly going, can you give me some time to go back and talk to Ron, Doug, and Sheila and get back to you with an answer? So that was very helpful as we went through, and also their engagement oftentimes with bill sponsors and other stakeholders, even as the bills were being introduced or drafted before they were being introduced. So that was really helpful from our point. But we've got, basically, as I would characterize them, we had bills to increase transit of some form or another, as well as bills tying transportation to housing. And then the vulnerable road user bill. But maybe start with, I'll go to the next page on 1447, the one that didn't pass. The RTD, so-called RTD reform bill. I won't spend time on that unless somebody wants to make comments about that, since it didn't pass, but I assume we may see something Next year, maybe it'll be discussed at Transportation Legislation Review Committee this summer. We'll be monitoring that committee very closely, I think, this summer to see what other conversations come out of that. But obviously, Senate Bill 32 that we have here on page 2 went through a number of iterations as it went through the process, particularly relating to the youth free fare and then changes to the free transit grant program. And Ron, I don't know if you want to make any comments about that or.
I'll just note that the original intent of the bill was to continue the ozone season free fare grant program from the state. RTD has taken advantage of that for the first couple of years of that program to do free fares during, I think it was 1 month the first summer and 2 months last summer. And so that program was set to expire. So it renewed that grant program at the state level. Other transit agencies around the state had also taken advantage of that and seen some real benefits. The Senate Bill 32 then added a free fare for youth program, grant program to transit agencies. Notable, Senate Bill 32 now precludes RTD from seeking grant funds for the ozone season free fare program. So that was sort of an interesting development that I had not anticipated, but they are given grant funding for their free fare youth program for all year long for people 19 years and younger, I believe is the age for that program. So more to come on that.
We'll see.
Yeah, that's great. You want to elaborate on House Bill 1313 a little bit?
Yeah, we can. That's definitely what Ron needs to talk about. But I'll add one piece to it too that I don't think is mentioned in that summary. But obviously 1313 went through massive amounts of amendments and changes.
Yes.
Yeah. But maybe I would ask, is the general feeling that the final product that most people, whichever side of the issues we were on, can live with the final product?
I will call on my own staff member because I feel like Danae has been following this really well. Danae, do you want to speak to this for Broomfield, and others can also pipe in too?
Sure. I think at least from the staff perspective, obviously some of the core issues with 1313 that were identified, I think consistently across the local governments was the use of taking away the highway user tax fund dollars as kind of the stick of the bill in the original introduced bill. And the second piece being there was an injunction where DOLA could actually file a lawsuit against local governments that didn't meet the housing opportunity goal requirements of the bill. Those were successfully removed in the Senate. And I think the clock was in our favor in that the House wasn't necessarily happy with some of those changes, but there wasn't enough time for conference committee to try to change it again. So those were the two core pieces of the bill that were taken out. The administration and sponsors worked with many of us to try to address some of the other exemptions or challenges that we all face as local governments. As we know, housing needs has a very local lens. And so a statewide policy or a policy that spans, the area of our communities is very challenging. I can speak for Broomfield. Those were the two core issues. I think that obviously there's still preemption and removal of local control with the administrative approval process. So it requires an administrative approval process for 5 acres or less for land use decisions. So that was a piece that's still a concern for Broomfield that remained in the bill. But to your question, I think it was definitely a little more chewable than it was when it was introduced.
Could you say the same thing about the parking minimums and the ADUs?
Yeah, it's that crux of local control, right? And how much are local governments willing to give up to move this needle that we know is a challenge in all of our communities. So it's chewable. I'll use the word chewable, I think is kind of where we landed as a community, at least And we are grateful that they at least took those amendments to the last minute to make it something that at least we can work with. When they were all originally introduced, to your point, we were feeling there was no way. So not perfect, not saying that, but at least we can try to make a dent in these changes. So
Yeah, is it gum or is it food, right? Is it chewable and we're not really able to digest it, or is it actual food and nourishment?
That's good.
I think, that's something to really think about. I know that some commissioners in Broomfield are still really upset about the lack of local control. So we actually will still be talking about this bill. And I would say that our county commissioners aren't too happy about it still. So it is more chewable. You're right, Danae. And would love it. Have any other input from any other commissioners or staff members online if you wanted to speak to 1313?
I'll be quick, and I'll say for Denver County, the local control piece was huge, but it's also I think we saw a missed opportunity with. If the state wants to engage in this discussion to incentivize or encourage more transit-oriented communities and development, the idea should be at least a more consistent approach on what are those incentives for folks who are doing it. There are other ways in which the state can provide pressure on folks who aren't, but to have this big omnibus bill with these huge sticks in it just didn't seem like a good first step. And I think this may roll down to our legislative discussion. How do we, as commissioners that have really great TOD legislation already that's governing our counties, how do we inform in the off season folks who are looking more globally and more statewide? So possibly chewable, but the ADU one is we're sponsoring ADU legislation. I'm jumping onto housing. I'm one of the co-sponsors of that within for citywide ADUs, and the state completely upended our form-based and suburban zoning process with this bill, and it's going to be harmful to communities in Denver. So even though we support ADUs, the idea that the state continues to come in and really aren't looking at what's on the books, or folks are doing it correctly, is of concern.
Thank you, Commissioner Watson. Yeah, let's keep moving. Yeah.
If you don't mind, just because Dr. Cogg's staff we've spent a considerable amount of time on the ADU, well, not as much on the ADU bill, but a little bit, but on 1313, the TOC bill, and on the parking bills. And I will say, I think from a staff perspective, obviously our board was not able to reach consensus on a position on 1313. So we were officially monitoring that bill, but we were engaged with the legislature and with the governor's office and staff on sort of issues. And obviously we heard loud and clear that, the HUTF and the injunction pieces of 1313 were really tough pills to swallow at the local government level, and for good reason. We worked really hard to get some additional exemptions clarified in that bill about where the housing zoning and capacity should be applied, because at the first iterations of that were pretty tough and way too expansive. And so we were pleased to see some of those refinements get into the bill for the funding sort of hammer to be pulled out of the bill at the end of the day. We were also pushing to narrow the geography a bit more and eliminate the corridors piece, just because we see that as a much more complicated issue than the station areas. As a matter of fact, the geographic extent of the corridors is much greater than the station area geography. And much more complicated because the parcel sizes tend to be smaller. It's more linear, so it's tough to figure out how you can actually accommodate sort of the zoning capacity in those corridors. And the barriers to development are more extensive in those corridors. And I agree with you, Councilor Watson. The partnership between the local jurisdictions and the state still isn't quite there. And I think we had a tough time demonstrating or convincing the legislators and the staff that, you know, 35 or $65 million of state sort of incentives is nowhere near enough to actually address the barriers to the kind of development that I think in general, most people want to see around those transit investments. And we had a really good conversation with Westminster staff about one of their station areas where they've actually done the zoning work. They've done the pre-development work to accommodate the kind of development everyone wants to see around transit stations, and invested $100 million of public money into that station area. And it's still not popping, right? And so to think that a state investment of $35 or $65 million is gonna crack that nut, I think is sort of foolish. And so we need to continue those conversations about what is the right partnership to actually address the barriers to getting the development in place.
Yeah, and I've noticed, you know, I do a lot of fundraising in my nonprofit role for refugees. And the only way that I can convince people to give us money is by telling a story. So anecdotally, we have a lot of cross-sectionality on the way that we serve people. So we talk about aging adults. We can't serve them if we don't have transportation. Same with our new refugee population. We can't serve them without transportation. So that story piece of how much transportation affects other things is just really critical and important. And I think it should be elevated, you know, quite a bit. Yeah. All right, let's see, what do we have left on your part here? Sorry. We had transportation.
Just housing.
And just housing, yeah.
Yeah, so Senate Bill 174, I know Dr. Cockburn, I think it was a position of support with amendments. And we had a lot of engagement with CML staff and so forth to work on various pieces of that. How do people feel about 174? It went through a lot of iterations too and sat for a while in the House. Once it got to the House, I think it was at least a month before it started to move. I was beginning to wonder what was going to happen. But it did make it through, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Do we have any staff or any commissioners online that want to address that particular part about housing or any other parts, maybe even construction defects as well?
Which of course, none of the bills passed.
Yes.
I'll jump in really quickly, just in regards to the bigger topic of housing and also a question that I have maybe as we finish up the conversation, Commissioner Hinkle, in regards to which big topic items does MACC want to focus on regarding legislation for the next session? So that's kind of a separate question. I will just say around housing, one of the pieces that we've talked about at Boulder County in all of our work, but also specific to the housing, is the concern I have around implementation and the assessment, grants, all of those different pieces that tend to become afterthoughts of how we really address a housing crisis. And I'm still looking for legislation, for advocacy, for policies at the state level, local level, and of course, federal would be amazing to really get to some of the bigger pieces around inventory, capital gains reductions, programs that we haven't tried in regards to housing versus studies and grants. And I just feel like we know we have a housing crisis. And so, and the other piece around that is, I believe there was a lot of movement in the session vocally around the issues of racial equity, the issues of policies that have created that. And we are part of that as the government in regards to legislation and all of the pieces around housing about not just redlining, but also government programs about accessibility, et cetera. And so I believe there's a huge opportunity for us in Colorado to look at that as well. But if we don't articulate it, we don't speak about it, we don't write it in our legislation, I just feel like, unfortunately, we're going to continue to move some of those issues the same way we always have, which isn't necessarily effective and or could potentially change outcomes for us. So that's just some encouragement and some things for us to think about if we really are going to do significant legislative work in 2025 and in the future as MACC. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Commissioner Loshman. Appreciate that. So many times we don't think about, you know, the outliers of the conversation actually weighing in on what is actually the crux of the problem. You know, many times people say, why don't you move forward with this housing? And then we talk about supply and demand, or, you know, other ways that we can free up, you know, faster construction of units. So I do think that that is definitely worth a conversation. Thank you. All right, thank you, Rich. Do you have anything else for us?
That's it.
You good? Okay, thank you so much for your presentation. And again, just really want to thank Dr. Cog for being here, and just your efforts and your support, and just the way that we can work with you all has just been monumental. So thank you so much. Okay, next up is talking about our bylaws subcommittee designation. You should have had the charter emailed to you this morning. I realized it was not accessible. I had read it before, but then I realized I cannot access it again. And so, you know, Commissioner Watson and I were talking about what does the MACC look like moving forward. And thank you for that historical context, Commissioner Layden, as well. We know that there's been some contentious issues, and if we can wrap our minds and our efforts around, you know, a certain amount of issues, which we'll dive into later, we first kind of need to talk about how do we operate as the MACC and the charter. You know, Commissioner Watson can speak more to this too. But he said, you know, it would be really good if instead of all of us, you know, diving into the bylaws and the charter, why don't we have some sort of subcommittee diving into those issues? So Commissioner Watson, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, and my thought is, I think obviously each of the commissioners, we value everyone's input on really what our governing documents are. I mean, it helps to make sure that we are all feeling that our structure meets the expectations we have for joining this board, this commission. But I think maybe having a tighter, smaller group of folks really kind of sussing out similar organizations. What are we seeing within our charter and our bylaws that we want to, you know, applaud? What are some things maybe we may want to bring forward to the full board to say, hey, possibly these are things that we may want to look differently at, especially as we move into maybe a position of highlighting kind of what the Metro Area County commissioners believe in as far as legislatively, or even when it comes to our regional collaboration. Ensuring that that voice and that is elevated within our governing documents, I think, is important. So really today was checking in, getting the temperature of commissioners on your thoughts on that approach, that we have 2 or 3 folks, 3 or 4, wherever the number is, whoever raises a hand would be on it. So it could be as many as we need, but if we can have a small team, and prior to our next meeting, that small team meets a little bit separately, whether it's virtual or in person, we can decide that. And we just kind of walk through our governing documents, receive input from the other commissioners, and then bring forward those ideas to a more robust discussion at our next commission meeting.
Great, thank you, Commissioner Watson. Does anyone want to chime in about that, or, you know, look at our charter right now as it stands? How has it been going? What do you guys see moving forward in developing this subcommittee? And are there any people interested? Commissioner Loachman? You're on mute, sorry.
Thank you for that. Thanks for getting us started on the conversation. We did take a look at it in what would have been the end of 22 maybe. As I don't have any particular concerns, but I'm always open to having if there's a small group of people that really do want to look at it and do some updating or otherwise. My understanding was that it had kind of already been looked at maybe 2 years prior to that, with they're, I want to say, rebooting. Somebody described it a little differently from a historical standpoint earlier this morning, but so I just want to offer that. I have no objections to if folks want to take a look at it and maybe bring back some recommendations. And I'm not raising my hand to be part of it just because I've done some review with it from other folks.
That's why I heard your voice. I thought it was a hand raise.
A different hand raise. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Commissioner. Commissioner Layden?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I would echo that. I think this is always the benefit of new folks getting elected and stepping on board and bringing fresh energy. And I think that's really welcomed and appreciated. But I would agree. We literally just went through this kind of bylaw and operating agreement document update. So, I think there was a lot of brain damage that went into that. But certainly not opposed to updating. If there's a good idea, we don't wait to do great. On the legislative piece, that may predate even a few that were in leadership in the last few years, and that goes back, I said, like about six or 8 years ago. And the real power of MACC, I think, is in its bipartisan sensibility. And I don't know if there are commissioner or former legislators on this call that want to ring in, but the weight of an organization that is hyperpartisan is very limited at the legislature. And we know that pendulum will swing back and forth. One of the reasons, just to give CCI as an example, that we really wanted somebody from the Democrat Party to be in leadership, Steve O'Dorisio, dear friend, really balanced, reasonable, thoughtful individual. We really wanted Steve to be in leadership at CCI because he brought that bipartisan element to the organization, which historically has leaned very far to the right. CCI has more influence as a bipartisan organization. I think similarly, MACC, if we continue to identify areas that your average citizen, regardless of their party affiliation, would not disagree with. And I look back historically to things like 988. I was deeply passionate about a 3-digit mental health line, and so were so many of you that were around at that time, federally, state, and locally. And we just got it done, sailed through the legislature. We saw that happen with human trafficking. I think where we lose our way is immediately gravitating to the issues that divide us, and then trying really, really hard to advocate for those things that people just patently disagree with. That can be a fun exercise, but I think what's far more productive is just identifying those issues that everybody agrees with and getting them done. Marta talked a little bit about, the affordability crisis. That is, I grew up in Boulder, went to CU for law school. That's a college town. I have a thought around a bipartisan way to advance affordability, and that's dealing with the trial lawyers, that defeated all of the construction defect bills at the legislature this year. If we had really robust construction defect legislation, the average person could purchase a 1-bedroom, 1-bath condo affordably, which is the building blocks of wealth. Right now, nobody can afford a condo because, first of all, they could, but the condos don't exist. So that's just one example of where construction defect might be a bipartisan issue. So that's my only caution is we've gone down the bylaws path in the past, always open to new ideas. But my hope is that we're not just a partisan legislative advocacy organization, because there are a lot of those. So thanks, guys. Sorry, I know that was a lot, but been doing this for a little bit.
Thank you, Commissioner Layden. Yeah, it was interesting. I was just talking with Commissioner Watson about, this is my 5th year being elected and just reelected this year. And the more I dive into things, the more actually simplistic views I have sometimes. Sometimes I dive into the details your first couple of years, and then you just really let the issues rise to the top that you can move forward with. And I completely agree, Commissioner Layden, as far as, those issues go, and making sure that we really are, tracking alongside each other. And the history of Broomfield, our mayor, said the reason why MACC just, disbanded really is because people just couldn't agree. They couldn't, even agree, I think, even on how to argue, which is, unfortunate. So I think, within our bylaws or our charter, there is something within there, that just says we honor the intent of others and own the impact of our words. We honor the freedom to speak in confidence, rough draft, and without fear of reprisal. We keep our minds open to learn from the views of others. We share the air so that all voices can be heard. We show up on time and limit digital phone time during meetings so that we can all actively participate. That was interesting. I know. We hold each other accountable to honoring our norms and values. And I think so many times it's good to recognize our shared values. And I think that that's really important. And so how about this? I'll just propose this to the group. It sounds like we've done a lot of work on the charter already. If anyone has ideas maybe about if you want to change the charter, you can bring that to us maybe for the next meeting if we want to discuss it. So perhaps we don't need like a subcommittee, but if you have any ideas that you want to, add or, take away from the charter that we could discuss at our next meeting, please feel free to look at that.
Yep.
And then we will discuss that charter, I think, at our next meeting more in full now that we have more access to it. And that kind of brings up a point too. And I talked about this, really at lunch with Commissioner Layden after our last MACC meeting. We need to talk about just some sort of consistency from year to year. And part of that might be a website. Part of that might be, making sure that we're keeping everything in one place, because those documents were actually held with Arapahoe County, I believe. And so we're still trying to look up what that strategic map looks like. So we're still hunting down our historic documents. So I think, having a shared space for us moving forward for these documents would be helpful. So does anyone have any questions, comments at this point? Okay, all right. So I used to be a high school teacher, so I'm reminding you of your homework. Your homework is just to look over the charter, and we'd love to have your viewpoints and, up to tee it up for next time. And then the fourth one, this last part of our meeting today, which now we're on time. Number 3 went really fast. Look at us. The engagement in the legislative off season. Our Broomfield commissioners have really been, and I'll just be really frank, a lot of us have been really frustrated at the lack of just feeling like we've been heard by our legislators, to be quite honest. And that isn't like a jab. I think everyone's trying to solve the same problem. And I really feel like we're going about it in different pathways, and we just need to make sure that we have open ears and stakeholdering before we head into these legislative processes. Commissioner Watson, do you want to speak to this too, or?
Yeah, and I think Commissioner Layden shared some points as well. I think from my perspective, with this being me newly being on this committee, I think we have the ability through the metro area commissioners to espouse views and to support legislation that impacts our counties. I think we should. And I know Denver County has, we are being a little bit more aggressive in how we communicate within the legislature as far as the things that impact the pillars of things that we support. And we're going to redefine that because this year we were on pretty much everything. Denver County commissioners, we spoke to so many divergent issues. We're going to zero in maybe a little bit more and make sure that we are even more successful. And I think the opportunity for our group is to do the same. I don't see that this is naturally going to move towards something that's divisive. I think we have the commissioners on that are here at these meetings that really want to look for regional approaches on issues that we all have shared values on. And I think we can. I think being strategic as to what those are in the off season is what I'm hoping we can speak to. What should we lean into? I mean, housing is a no-brainer, but what else? And what part of housing? As we spoke to access and all of the other things that are underlying impacts to folks having housing. So I think this is going to be a worthwhile discussion. I think this summer off season, us engaging more fully and this early fall is going to be great. So that when we do have all the legislative bills, the 900 most likely next year we'll be a little more strategic as to how we leverage Dr. Cog and other partners on our thoughts.
Definitely. Thank you, Commissioner Watson. Someone is raising their hand. Commissioner Pinter.
Hello.
Speak it.
It's been a really great conversation. I would like to add that I think one of the challenges that repeats itself in the legislature is a shared feeling by local elected officials that the legislators and or the governor's team don't fully understand what counties do in particular. That there seems to be a lack of understanding that our funds, our general funds, that we support our district attorneys, that we support our court buildings, our detention centers, that we support our sheriff's office. A large percentage of our funds go to gap fill around human services that is never fully funded. And just as it was spoken about earlier by my colleague from the South, Abe Layden, that we care about human trafficking. Well, you can't do a child and family investigation without human services. And so if we care about the welfare of children, we need to have child protective services, child support, and all those ancillary workforce center programs that are so important for the well-being of community be fully funded. And I just think that we're dealing with a climate where it is a legacy and a hangover, and maybe this is the part where I go out on a limb a little bit, a legacy and a hangover from the pandemic, where it was easy to get mad at your health department. It was easy to get mad at your county for imposing rules or regulations. But the fact of the matter is that we are the ones who hold the authority around supporting human services, public health, behavioral health, and we need to tell that story better, because I feel like we try to tell it one at a time as each bill comes up, but there isn't a good understanding. Folks were talking about land use. There isn't a good understanding of why you can both care about density and be concerned about 1313. So I would offer to the good of the order that we represent most of the state's population on this Zoom right now. And how do we articulate what the value proposition is? What are your counties actually doing in a way that the Gold Dome can hear us?
Great comments. Thank you, Commissioner Pinter. I really appreciate that. There is a lot of education piece that needs to happen, and I completely agree. Commissioner Layden? Abe, there you are.
I was gonna, yeah, hi guys. I was gonna echo the comments of my colleague that came in the same time as me, Commissioner Pinter. I couldn't agree more. And I think the honest reality is that most legislators have no idea what counties do, and we just need to be intellectually honest about that. But part of our job, being proactive, is I think to initiate the stakeholding. We always ask for more engagement with county officials and more stakeholding before new legislators drop a bill. Maybe that's on us, and we proactively invite those that represent the metro area. And I think each county commissioner candidly probably knows every legislator in their county. And if they don't, I hope they might get to do that. But why not host a session? Maybe early summer or maybe early fall, late summer, early fall, where we have all of those legislators in to meet with MACC, or at least we send some correspondence. But I agree with that. And, Commissioner Watson, Councilmember Watson, has been phenomenal at listening to the people in his district. And I continue to hear about that. So maybe listening is the next step.
Thank you, Commissioner Layden. Does anyone want to speak to making sure that we aren't duplicating efforts of others? That's just sort of coming up in my head right now. Making sure that, maybe we hit on a certain amount of topics. Are there certain topics, because we know Dr. Cog works on aging, transportation, housing. We have elevated housing quite significantly in the past, and we have leaned into bills that I have seen that other people, I wouldn't say like skip over, but I would say that we've really leaned into bills that have been really important to our counties that may not have received attention. The big attention, like the 1313 bills, right? So I'm wondering where we can lean in. What's duplicative? What's not duplicative? I don't know always what other people do, so I don't know what the Metro Mayor's Caucus does necessarily in the off season. If someone can speak to that for us, I'd really appreciate it. And or you know, what sort of areas where we could move forward, and maybe we host an event in September and invite not only our own legislators, but I've noticed sometimes, and I'm not super actually political, to be quite honest. I tell everyone I'm mostly a mom. And I really like to engage advocacy in my nonprofit role. But I will say that there are certain legislators that have a keen sense to, you know, leading in the transportation realm, right? If we talk to the chair of the transportation committee, or if we talk to people that generally have, you know, more leeway and just more say and political impact in these areas, if we can invite them to the table as well. Does anyone have any thoughts on what other people are doing in the off season? And maybe you can educate me, and staff also, please feel free to pipe up too.
Staring at Dr. Cog, folks.
I'll maybe a couple of comments, Madam Chair, because while I'm no longer a lobbyist, in a previous life, I have been a lobbyist at the local government level and the state level. And, you know, when I was doing lobbying for a city in Oregon, it was always really important for me to get my mayor, my city councilors to engage and build relationships with our state legislators during the off season, because it's much easier to have a conversation with them during session about a particular piece of legislation if you already have a relationship foundation with them, rather than showing up cold and trying to build a relationship and advocate at the same time. Those are two things that can be difficult to happen at the same time. So I certainly, at least unsolicited, would advise that if you are interested as the MACC to have some shaping and influence over the next legislative session process, that being proactive between now and then in doing some work to build those relationships, to engage either individually as your own commissioners with your legislators, or as a group to host an event or two to educate. But that means doing some pre-work now about identifying those specific issues you want to focus on as a group, and being able to convey those messages. But even beyond just having those messages, just sitting down and engaging with your state legislators now and having a relationship, so that if you do need to contact them during the session, you already have that foundation built.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I appreciate your historical knowledge in that area too. I think it's important, you know, when you understand, you know, working with legislators, and just in talking with my own representative, who's actually a dear friend of mine. I heard him speak to me, and he said, well, you know, I didn't hear from you guys about this until now.
Right.
And so I was like, oh, okay, you know, that is on us. And I know that they also have full-time jobs in addition to this. So I also want to be very clear in that I feel, and this is maybe just my own personal thought too, I feel like we can also weigh in on the structure of the legislature, what's working in the structure of the legislature as well. I know that their ideas are bringing, you know, they have to be brought forth in October, I believe, as well. Like a lot of them say, hey, I really need to start bringing my bills forward even in October.
Sometimes though, they've heard in the summer.
Yeah.
Okay.
And sometimes it's maybe not till October or November. Of course, it's different, if I may.
Yeah.
I'm sure. It's a little bit different this year, or maybe a little bit trickier this year, because being an election year. So if you if you want to have an event in the fall, some of you might have people there who aren't going to be in the legislature. So that's a little tricky. But if I could maybe just throw out a couple of thoughts for fodder for future conversation. One of the things I was thinking about, and it could happen before the session, could also happen after or during the session, is I know Dr. Cog, for instance, has on occasion done like a legislative breakfast, and a lot of groups do legislative breakfast during the session. We might do that again this year, or maybe it's worth having a conversation if we want to do a joint Dr. Cog, Metro Mayor's Caucus, and MACC. And it could even be an offsite event too. Sometimes that happens. And again, it could be before or after. And of course, there's the December legislative reception that MACC and Metro Mayor's Caucus have worked on for many years now, although I don't see a whole lot of legislators showing up to that, if I might comment. I don't know if others have the same reaction. But maybe some of those kinds of things are possible. And I like what Ron said about, you know, it might be okay to you know, blend in a couple of major issues or whatever, but most of it is really just building those relationships.
Thank you. Commissioner Kraft-Tharp?
So I wasn't going to say anything, but just to kind of give us a different perspective, I was at the retreat, 2 years ago, 2021, and we had a very, very robust discussion around what are not only about the charter and the bylaws and all that, but also about what do we do. And part of that conversation was about not being duplicative. Everybody is dealing with the legislature. Everybody gravitates towards how can we advocate, how can we, support bills. But there's a number of organizations that deal with municipalities and counties that's the work that they do. And counties do a whole lot more, which is why we've spent time talking about homeless issues. So I guess I would suggest that before we gravitate towards being another organization that advocates to the legislature and our whole purposes around the legislature, let's look at what do we all do, and that should we be working on those issues? Like, one of the things it seems to me is the migrant issue. That right now we really hear from Denver and Douglas, but we all should be talking about that on a regional level. So I guess I just want to throw that out, that maybe what we look at doing, whether it's off session or whether it's our purpose, is what are the things that counties should be working on a regional basis that may not be around advocating for legislation.
Thank you, Commissioner Kraft-Tharp. Yeah, I actually mentioned your name the other day because I was talking about, we want to make sure we aren't duplicative. And I remember you actually speaking to that and just making sure that we aren't, I wouldn't say just another organization. I will say that we do different things than city councils do in general. So the counties are responsible for the health and human services, and we're seeing that impacted for sure. So yeah, I think leaning in, I'm just going to give my voice here, but just leaning into the issues that affect us as a city and county. And I don't want to lose, and maybe you could speak to this, Commissioner Kraft-Tharp, about, I don't want to lose this piece where we're educating each other. Because I have been in CCI and I have been in CCAT. I've been in all these other groups as the delegate there. And I feel like there isn't enough even education amongst ourselves in those groups. I feel like we're still trying to tackle how do we work regionally in this homelessness issue. And we did agree on services. And I want to, really commend Commissioner Loachman on really moving that all forward with Heidi in those areas and really kind of educating each other. I will say also, I attended a problems-based learning group out of North Glen High School. And what they did is they were given a problem by the community saying, help us solve this problem. And I attended it, and I actually got a lot of good ideas from the youth on how to resettle the migrants. They even brought up ideas like, let's build a website where we have jobs that are geolocated on a map, so they don't have to worry about transportation. They could start picking up jobs that are close to them. I mean, these are something that these kids are really thinking about. So actually, I put it upon them as a problem to attack in the fall, and they're willing to come back to us with some solutions on how we can work regionally on the homelessness issue. And so we have youth power and time and working on those issues, and possibly even educating all of us on maybe some ideas that they might have, and then also engaging with our cities and counties and those sorts of things. So I think I agree with you, Commissioner Kraft-Tharp, and that we don't want to lose that education piece. Is that what you're speaking to as well?
Well, I think there's an education piece, but there's also a piece around there's a lot of work that we all do, and how can we do it regionally? Or how can we learn from each other? Maybe that's more education, but I mean, there's a lot more that we do than just advocating to legislators. And I speak to somebody who was a legislator, and I absolutely believe that the work they do is important, but it's not the end all be all.
Yeah, yeah. If there's one thing we've known that, and they'll tell you too, the legislators aren't going to be the answers to all of our problems, right? Okay, anyone else have any thoughts on this, engaging the off season? I have some ideas kind of percolating in my brain as far as homework goes. I'm thinking, and maybe push back, throw out an idea. This is very informal today. I'm thinking that we go to our fellow commissioners and our council members, and we ask them, you know, what maybe 3 subjects that we could attack and educate, right? And keep that piece to it. So housing is something that we've really discussed, and a subset of that is homelessness. And I think we can elevate that as one of our top priorities. Are there other subjects like transportation that affects us regionally, and really focus on this metro area? Yep. Does anyone else have any other ideas that you can bring to your fellow commissioners that you want to possibly elevate? Commissioner Loachman.
Thank you. I'm working on all the buttons over here. I'm in a different workspace today. I similar, and thanks for the brainstorm and the time to do a little bit of that, which we talk about it as generative discussion and other board work that I do. And a lot of times we're so reactive that we don't get this time. So thanks for that. I am interested in, I think, connected to what Commissioner Kraftthorpe was talking about, but from the workforce space, work permit, work authorization, economic development, and do a lot of, so I put something in the chat just in regards to connecting that with education and opportunities. So that was it.
Yeah, thank you so much. We'll put that in our notes for sure. Commissioner Layden?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo Tracy's comments. Tracy is 100% right. And I think, speaking as a former legislator, what I hear her saying is we need to kind of step into our power a little bit. You know, there are so many organizations advocating at the legislature, and then what, your bill doesn't pass and we've lost a year. Whereas this group represents half the state's population. Emma said it very well. If we find 1 or 2 issues for this next year, Heidi, I like your suggestion. Let's brainstorm, find those 1 or 2 things that we all agree on, and get them done as counties. Maybe we take a regional approach to our county work with our own boards and our own budgets. And if there's a legislative component or corollary to that, fantastic. But there are so many issues on public safety and homelessness. And I'm coming back on human trafficking next year, and that'll be very bipartisan. There are issues that I think we can all agree on, that instead of just focusing on what our legislators can do, boy, each of you are so powerful in your roles. Working together, I think we can accomplish really great things.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Layden. I appreciate that. I also know, Commissioner Pinter, you and I were working on a letter quite a few years ago talking about, you know, how we could work together as Broomfield County and Adams County on working on some sort of transitional housing for, you know, people who are victims of abuse, right? Of, you know, domestic violence. Do you want to speak to that work? Do you feel like this is an area where we could move forward with even ideas on where we can even apply for grant funding or congressional district spending money as a region? I don't know what your thoughts are on that. I just put you on the spot.
No, that's all right. I think that domestic violence is a huge issue. one of the things that is a gap in our community, I don't know if it's regional, but it's certainly a gap for us, is we don't have a single point of contact for victims of domestic violence within Adams County. And so we're looking at the Rose Annam Center, which is in Denver. We're looking at SPAN, which is in Boulder, and Porchlight, which is in Jeffco. We're looking to our neighbors for what y'all have been able to accomplish. And so we're working really diligently on that right now. Our information shows that when you have a family justice center, that community has a significant drop. Our DA has been able to cite those numbers in mortality, in death. So if you have a family justice center, it literally saves lives, and we don't have one in Adams County. We also know internally from our numbers currently, domestic violence is our most common inciting cause to homelessness. Working on domestic violence will also prevent homelessness in Adams County. So there's a lot of intersectional equity issues to be talked about: language access, LGBTQ affirming. There's a number of layers here to intimate partner violence, but we're taking that work on. And it's complicated, and it will require us to work internally in our region. And I've had the opportunity to tour both SPAN and Porchlight and Jeffco, so yay to Boulder and Jeffco. But we're working on these processes right now. I don't know that that's something, I mean, I know you'd all cheer us on if we got this sorted out for Adams County, because right now when we have a victim, we house them in one of your counties, but I don't know how that balances out as a regional issue.
Okay, thank you for your thoughts, Commissioner Pinter. Abe, is your hand still raised, or is it a perpetual hand raise?
It's a legacy.
Sorry, I apologize. I was just cheering for Family Justice Center. Sorry, I'll take it down.
Okay, thank you so much. Really appreciate this. Are there any other points of input? Okay. Well, feel free to still chime in as I kind of wrap this up here today. I just wanted to really appreciate your time and efforts and really thoughtfulness in this sort of, gray area where we really need to figure out how we can work as a region, not only in educating ourselves, but each other, and working together towards action. And if something does land, Commissioner Lane and I agree, if something does land at the legislature, we'd be most appreciative. I do think in the fall, we do need to plan for something. Now, whether or not that's with Dr. Cog and the Metro Mayor's Caucus is to be determined. I think we're a small group. It might be wise to, maybe sort of add ourselves to something like that. Or if we want to do something more small and intimate, maybe provide feedback individually to me, or, maybe we can discuss that at our next meeting as far as what that event would be. But I'm thinking September might be a good time, and I'm even thinking too, if we can even give feedback to the legislative processes. So they have 5 bills, and I'm almost thinking that we had so many bills this year, it was overwhelming. What does that look like for our legislators? And I'm wondering if we can have more of a education, but also conversation with our legislators. I think sometimes at the bigger events, there isn't much, discussion and more of an intimate setting that I think we could provide. So just sort of food for thought for now. If you have any other thoughts, you can speak now, or you can also give me a call or an email too. Same with Commissioner Watson. Commissioner Watson, do you have anything to add?
No, I think this was a great discussion. I mean, I think oftentimes we're not going to have kind of this time to kind of speak through our thought process and what our next steps are. So I think this is fantastic, and I agree. I think we can do both. Have a regional approach as we look at opportunities to do things regionally through our power as commissioners, and then also ensuring that if there is legislation that is impacting our region, that we have a more proactive stance than we can.
Definitely. Thank you so much. And thank you for, I read your chat in there, Commissioner Loachman. I really appreciate that. All right, so homework is look over the charter if there's any additions. Second piece of homework is go to other council members and or if you're a straight up commissioner and you get paid more than I do, feel free to talk to those, small amount of people, and just really have a discussion on what major 3 things do you guys think that we could work as a region? And let's bring back those 3 things at our next meeting. And then hopefully we can kind of let the foam settle a little bit, and figure out if we've made something that's gum or food, right? If we're willing to make it digestible for other people as well. So thank you so much for today. Thank you for your time and everyone's input. And I'm glad that we have some former legislators here, state legislators. I feel like that is such a great, perspective. And I really appreciate everyone's time.
Awesome.
Great.
Take care, everyone.
Have a good day.